Good afternoon, dear students. Today we also continue talking about history of trends in foreign language teaching. And there are 3 points I'm going to focus on: humanistic approach to language teaching, community language learning, the silent way, Suggestopedia. It may seem that radical changes in our social, political, and economic life have little to do with foreign language teaching, but they do. The world we live in today is gradually becoming one big community. We teach people to communicate in a foreign language, thus we actually prepare them for living in this international club. We also have to admit that today, with travel which has become more available to us, with computer technologies in many of our homes, the nature of social contact and therefore communication is changing. They are rapidly becoming more cosmopolitan and relaxed, less egocentric and considerably more democratic. This calls for new approaches in the classroom, the approaches that may help meet the social needs today, whether we like it or not. The methods we choose are, in a way, a social response to the changing world, a kind of feedback. An explosion of new and radical approaches to learning a language came to the light in the 1970s. These approaches are often grouped under the title of Humanistic Approaches due to their method concentration touching on innate ability and capacity that all learners are presumed to possess. Humanistic approach in English language teaching is an attempt to respond to these needs. Its basic principle is in shifting the focus in education from teaching to learning, so that the teacher is no longer the focal point in the class, but someone who facilitates the process of education. The new approach implies an entirely new role of the learner. It aims to make the learner more independent, since the responsibility for the learning process is to some extent handed over to him. The main idea is that the content of a lesson or syllabus is taught and learned from the point of view of the learner. The new centrality changes the conventional concept of instruction. It radically changes the role in the classroom and may be hard to accept, yet it seems worth discussing. It may work very well and be very effective if it's not the only one but one of the approaches used. Let's talk about the learner. The new role of the learner brings about some psychological problems related to his or her performance in the classroom. It is quite natural that if the burden of what is happening in class is shifted to the learner, while the teacher only facilitates the process, creating the appropriate psychological climate, the performance of the learner will most likely involve psychological stress, or more stress than before. In the new context, being in a group with a teacher who only coordinates and facilitates the process, the learner more than before faces such challenges of psychological nature as self-assertion, self-determination, self-esteem. The learner must demonstrate the ability to cooperate with the teacher and compete with his or her fellow students. He or she has to learn to cope with success and failure. The learner has to be very sensitive to how his or her fellow students feel in relation to him or herself and to each other. The new approach implies more psychological stress from the learner. It stimulates the learner's intelligence and curiosity, which work for his or her benefit. What's the difference between humanistic and traditional methods? Let's talk about humanistic approach. This approach is student-centered. Teacher is facilitator. Students are responsible for their own learning. Learning the language, communication, students has an active role, two-way communication and comparative learning. What about traditional? It is teacher-centered. Teacher authority. Teacher is responsible for the learning about the language, grammar rules, students' passive rules, one-way communication, competitive learning. Humanistic language teaching methods are humanistic in the sense, and they carry humanistic attitude and derive from the similar psychology and philosophy of education. If we talk about Suggestopedia, it was created by Georgy Lazanov. Suggestion, relaxation, and concentration. Decoration of the room must be done. Comfortable furniture, use of music, authoritative behavior of the teacher. If we are talking about silent way, it was created by Caleb Gategno, and Cuisinary roads are used. Sound, color chart, and word chart also applied. Total physical response (TPR) was created by James Escher, and they are given instruction commands. In the response, students perform physical movements, and these methods game-like movements stress reduced. Community language learning (CLL) was created by Charles Curran, and the students shares own ideas, and they have feelings between the counselor and the clients, and also community group learning, communication. Humanism, student-centered approach, facilitative teaching, individual, student as a whole person, self-actualization. Humanistic language teacher is counselor, facilitator. He guides students, he gives feedback, monitors, and the role of the students. And the roles of students in this method, in this approach, the students work together and support each other, ask for help only when nobody knows the solution. They work in pairs, in group, and cooperatively. Humanistic classroom is environment where in movement with and without moving the furniture, and there are some activities we can apply: rock, scissors, paper, people search, train tracks, and the students can sit like U-shaped or circular. When we are talking about the second issue, community language learning, is CLL, which is a language teaching approach in which students work together to develop what aspects of a language they would like to learn. It is based on counseling approach, in which this teacher acts as a counselor and a paraphraser, while the learner is seen as a client or collaborator. The community language learning emphasizes the sense of community in the learning group, encourages interaction as a vehicle of learning, and considers as a priority the student's feeling and recognition of struggles in language acquisition. CLL differs from other methods by which languages are taught. It is based on an approach model on counseling techniques that alleviate anxiety, threat, and personal language problems a person encounters in the learning of foreign languages. The method was originally developed by Charles Curran, who was inspired by Carl Rogers' view of education. In this counseling learning model of education, Learners in a classroom are seen as a group rather than a class, a group in dire need of certain therapy and counseling. The social dynamics occurring in the group are very important, and a number of conditions are needed for learning to take place. Members should interact in an interpersonal relationship. Students and teachers work together to facilitate learning by valuing each other, lowering the defense that prevent interpersonal interaction, reducing anxiety, and constituting a supportive community. Teachers' role is that of the true counselor. They are not perceived as a threat. They don't impose boundaries and limits. They concentrate on the learner's needs. Let's talk about stages in the learning process which learners go through with them. The first stage, birth stage. Feeling of security and belonging are established. Dependence on the knower, as learners have little or no idea of the target language. Self stage. As the learner's ability improves and starts to get an idea of how language works, they achieve a measure of independence from the parent, although they still seek help from the knower. Adolescence. The learners are independent, although they are aware of gaps in their knowledge and feel secure enough to take criticism and being corrected. The first stage, separate existence. Learners can speak independently. And the last stage is independence, complete independence from the knower. The child becomes an adult and becomes the knower. Let's talk about the third issue, silent way, which is a language teaching approach created by Caleb Getagno that makes extensive use of silence as a teaching method. Getagno introduced the method in 1963 in his book Teaching Foreign Language in Schools, The Silent Way. Getagno was critical of mainstream language education at the time, and he based the method on his general theories of education rather than on existing language pedagogy. It is usually regarded as an alternative language teaching method. Cook groups it under other styles. Richard groups it under alternative approach and methods. In Gene and Contesi group it under humanistic and alternative approaches. The method emphasized learner autonomy and active student participation. Silence is used as a tool to achieve this goal. The teacher uses a mixture of silence and gestures to focus students' attention, to elicit responses from them, and to encourage them to correct their own errors. Pronunciation is seen as fundamental to this method, with a great deal of time spent on each lesson. The silent way uses a structural syllabus and concentrates on teaching a small number of functional and versatile words. Translation and rote repetition are avoided, and language is usually practiced in meaningful context. Evaluation is carried out by observation, and the teacher may never set a formal test. Talking about silent way method, it's important to consider some teaching techniques. As the name implies, silence is a key tool of the teacher in the silent way. From the beginning level, students do 90% and more of the talking. Being silent moves the focus of the classroom from the teacher to the students and can encourage cooperation among them. Also, frees the teachers to observe the class. Silence can be used to help students to correct their own errors. Teachers can remain silent when a student makes a mistake to give them time to self-correction. They can also help students with their pronunciation by mouthing words without vocalizing and by using certain hand gestures. When teachers do speak, They tend to say things only once, so the students learn to focus their attention on